We've refused, we've been reluctant to trade with each other, to see and recognize each other's worth. We've come to that point, that inflection point in our history, when we must recognize that we need each other.
So, it didn't begin with sanctions, and, well, it didn't begin with handshakes in Washington either. It began with Africa refusing to kneel and daring to rise. For generations, the story of this continent was written by others, in languages not her own, with ink mixed from her own tears and sweat. They painted a picture of dependence, of poverty, of a land forever in need of saving. Beneath those imposed narratives, a different truth has always existed. It is rooted in ancient kingdoms, in unbreakable spirits, and in the quiet knowledge that the continent held seeds of its own destiny. And that season has arrived. The world now watches as the continent stirs. Not trembling with fear, but moving with a powerful, coordinated rhythm. A new generation of leaders, thinkers, and citizens are casting off colonial legacies. They are no longer asking for a seat. They are building their own, forged from rich and reinforced with the steel of self-determination. Whispers of rebellion have swelled into a mighty roar.
A declaration the old powers can no longer ignore.
This is not a sudden outburst, but a culmination. It is the legacy of giants, Nkrumah, Sankara, Lumumba, finding voice in the modern age. Their dream of a united, sovereign Africa is being pieced together. Quiet village defiance, scholarly debates in universities, and bold presidential pronouncements have converged into one movement. This is a tectonic shift. Power realigning not in UN halls, but in the hearts and minds of African people, from the shores of Cape Town to the markets of Cairo. The story unfolds in real time, on the world stage. It is a story of courage, reclamation, and a future being actively written. This awakening is spiritual and cultural. It's about remembering erased history and reclaiming diluted identity. Africa is not just rising. It is remembering who it has always been, a cradle of civilization, a wellspring of resources, and a titan of human potential, finally stirring to claim its rightful place in the sun. The first tremors were subtle, easily dismissed by the world's old guard. The first tremors were subtle, easily dismissed by the world's old guard. A leader in a small nation rejects a loan with predatory strings attached. A community blocks a foreign corporation from seizing its ancestral land. A group of intellectuals publishes a manifesto calling for economic independence. These were isolated events, seen as minor acts of insubordination, not a coordinated revolt. The architects of the old world. Order, comfortable in their centuries-old dominance, failed to see the pattern. They failed to understand that these were not random sparks, but the first flickers of a continental wildfire of defiance, fueled by a collective desire for dignity. This defiance is now impossible to ignore. It is bold, it is public, and it is unapologetic. We see it in the halls of power, where African leaders stand before global bodies and speak truth to power, their voices steady and firm. They are not asking for permission, but asserting their sovereign right to control their own resources. The era of bowing to Western capitals, of accepting deals that mortgage the future for a pittance in the present, is coming to a dramatic and decisive end. Donald Trump, a man who built his brand on the image of the ultimate dealmaker, suddenly found himself facing a reality he could not bully into submission. He treated international relations like real estate deals, but Africa was not for sale, nor a contractor to intimidate. When he used derogatory language, he expected fear. Instead, dignified silence, and unified, articulate rebukes. He was a showman who had lost his audience. Africa pulled back the curtain, exposing the emperor's new clothes for all to see. He was not the only Western leader left looking foolish and outmaneuvered. Across the capitals of Europe, a similar sense of bewilderment was setting in. They suddenly found their phone calls going unanswered and their directives being politely ignored. The sight of a French president sputtering about the rule of law after his country had benefited from exploitative contracts for a century was a moment of profound historical irony. At the United Nations, African blocs began voting with unprecedented unity, often in direct opposition to the interests of the United States and its allies. The moral high ground they had long claimed was eroding beneath their feet, washed away by a tide of historical truth. Trump's frantic, impotent rage was simply the most visible crack in a facade that was already breaking apart under the pressure of a continent's collective decision to stand up. To understand the revolt, you must first understand the system it seeks to dismantle. The old world order was not a random collection of events, it was a meticulously designed architecture of exploitation. It was a global system engineered over centuries, perfected in the colonial era, and rebranded for the modern age. This order was built on a simple, brutal premise that the resources of Africa were meant to fuel the prosperity of the West, while the continent itself was to be kept in a state of managed dependency. It promoted a narrative of Africa as a place of poverty, disease, and conflict, in constant need of saving by benevolent foreign powers. It was the most masterful deception in modern history, a global gaslighting campaign that masked exploitation as charity and control as partnership. It was a spider's web, intricate and nearly invisible, where every strand was designed to trap the continent and drain its vitality for the benefit of the spider. The primary currency of the old world order was not the dollar or the euro, it was debt. Debt was the modern-day chain, less visible than iron, but just as effective at ensuring servitude. After the era of formal colonization ended, a new system was put in place. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank began offering loans to newly independent African nations. The conditions attached to these loans, known as structural adjustment programs, were the true instruments of control. They were directives forcing governments to gut public services. They were forced to sell their most valuable resources, mines, telecommunications, water systems, to foreign corporations at bargain prices. This cycle of debt created a state of permanent crisis. Nations borrowed more to pay interest on existing loans, falling deeper into a financial abyss. It ensured that political independence never translated into genuine economic freedom, trapping Africa in a neo-colonial cage with bars made of interest rates and repayment schedules. The revolt moved from the halls of power directly to the source of the continent's wealth, the land itself. The gold in its veins, the diamonds in its depths, the oil beneath its seas were not seen as the birthright of its people, but as commodities on a global market. Resource reclamation was the moment Africa decided to become the master of its own house, to lock the chest and hold the key. This was not theft, it was the recovery of stolen property on a continental scale. The new leaders, armed with forensic audits and international legal expertise, exposed the lopsided nature of these deals. They passed laws requiring that a significant portion of raw materials be processed on African soil, breaking the old model of exporting raw wealth only to import expensive finished products. The resistance from multinational corporations was immediate and fierce, but this new generation of African leaders did not flinch. They understood a simple truth: the resources were in their ground. The corporations needed Africa more than Africa needed them on their old exploitative terms. In the gold fields of West Africa, they established state-owned gold refineries, ending the practice of shipping raw doré bars to Switzerland for processing. In the oil-rich deltas, the story was similar. Nations took commanding stakes in the offshore drilling operations. They demanded an end to destructive environmental practices and channeled new revenues into sovereign wealth funds. Perhaps most importantly, this reclamation was a spiritual act. It was about healing a deep wound in the continent's psyche. By taking back control of its resources, Africa was taking back its power, its pride, and its soul. It was a message to its own children. This land is yours. Its wealth is your inheritance, and its future is yours to build. The ink on the old contracts was a stain on the continent's conscience. These were not deals, they were documents of surrender. The act of tearing them up was more than just a legal or political maneuver. It was a ritual of purification, a symbolic bonfire of the vanities. This rejection of colonial-era agreements was methodical and precise. It was not born of populist rage, but of meticulous forensic investigation. Armed with this irrefutable proof of bad faith, they declared the contracts null and void, arguing that a deal predicated on deception has no legal or moral standing. The message to multinational corporations was radical and uncompromising. Any future investment would be on new terms of partnership, not predation. The tearing up of old deals was a promise to the next generation. We will not sell your birthright. This land and the wealth within it will be yours. Rejecting the old order came with an immediate, predictable cost. The architects of the global financial system unleashed their fury. But this new generation of African leaders understood that freedom is never free. They had calculated the cost and deemed it worth paying. Instead of backing down, they doubled down on self-reliance. The people responded not with panic, but with patriotic fervor. To counter the Western economic assault, these nations accelerated parallel systems. They proved they did not need Wall Street or the City of London to raise capital. The price of sovereignty was not economic collapse, but the liberating realization they no longer needed their former colonizers' approval or capital. The attempt to punish Africa backfired spectacularly. Shared resistance created an unbreakable bond, transforming separate revolts into a unified continental front. In the gilded halls of power in Washington, Paris, and London, a new and unfamiliar sound began to echo. Panic. Frantic, closed-door meetings followed. Intelligence analysts presented grim reports of unraveling influence. The subtle threat of a travel ban, the promise of a favorable loan. The pressure from multinational corporations was suddenly failing. Leaders, used to pulling strings, found themselves holding limp threads. Alarm rang loudest in the financial capitals. Nationalizations and cancelled contracts hit corporate bottom lines. The panic was economic. Publicly, they displayed forced calm. In press conferences, they invoked the rule of law and the sanctity of contracts, but their eyes betrayed anxiety. The panic in Western capitals was rooted in a simple, terrifying truth. Their levers of control were breaking. The primary lever was economic. But now, with Africa forging new alliances and building its own financial institutions, this lever was losing its pull. Another critical lever was military superiority. But a wave of popular protests across Africa demanded the closure of foreign bases. The third lever was diplomatic. But as the world became more multipolar, the West's attempts to isolate defiant nations were repeatedly defeated. They found themselves becoming the ones who were isolated. They were like pilots in a cockpit, frantically pushing buttons and pulling switches that no longer connected to the controls of the aircraft. The panic was existential. Africa's revolt had not just cut the strings of the puppet master, it had dismantled the entire stage, leaving the old powers exposed and powerless, before a world that was no longer playing by their rules. The revolt of the leaders would have been hollow without the roar of the people. Millions poured into public squares, students, farmers, union workers, mothers. Not a mob, but a disciplined, determined army of conscience. Their demands were simple: sovereignty, justice, and a future where their children wouldn't have to beg for dignity. The voice from below rose to meet the declarations from above, giving the political defiance its legitimacy and its soul. The uprising dissolved ethnic and religious divisions, breaking the old colonial tactic of divide and rule. 1,000 languages were speaking one word: freedom. Out of the crucible of revolt, a singular voice began to emerge, a voice woven from the many. This was the sound of Pan-Africanism reborn. This new Pan-Africanism was pragmatic and action-oriented. It moved beyond speeches to the hard work of building continental institutions. They pooled resources to fund massive cross-border infrastructure projects. They were no longer waiting for foreign investment. They were investing in each other. The chorus of unity was also a chorus of defense. When one nation was targeted, the entire continent responded. This was a policy of collective security. This solidarity rendered the West's favorite tactic of divide and rule completely obsolete. Africa was no longer a collection of weak states, but a formidable and unified bloc. The new Pan-African movement did not need to invent a new ideology, it only needed to remember. They were dusting off the blueprints left behind by the first generation of Pan-African giants. The visionary words of Kwame Nkrumah, the revolutionary integrity of Thomas Sankara, and the unwavering courage of Patrice Lumumba became the guiding stars of this new era. From Nkrumah, they took the grand vision of political unity. They understood, as he did, that only a unified continent could command respect on the world stage. From Sankara, they took the spirit of self-reliance and dignity, proving that his revolutionary fire had left behind embers that could ignite a continental flame. From Lumumba, they inherited the spirit of uncompromising defiance. His tragic story served as a permanent reminder of the price of sovereignty and the ruthlessness of the forces arrayed against them. By invoking his name, they were signaling that this time, the story would end differently. This time, the dream would not be deferred. The blueprint of the ancestors was finally being built. Africa's revolt was not an isolated event, it was a stone cast into the placid lake of the old world order, and its ripples spread to every shore. In the rising power centers of Asia, Africa's defiance was met not with alarm, but with admiration and a sense of profound opportunity. The response from Russia was equally significant. Moscow saw a historic chance to challenge Western hegemony, offering full-throated support for Africa's sovereign movements. The global chessboard was being fundamentally reset. Africa was emerging not as a pawn, but as a kingmaker. Across the global south, Africa's stand was a source of immense inspiration. Nations that had long chafed under the thumb of the IMF and World Bank saw in Africa's success a viable blueprint for liberation. The global echoes of Africa's revolt quickly coalesced into something more tangible, a new, informal alliance of sovereign nations. This was the coalition of the unchained. This emerging bloc began to coordinate its actions on the world stage, creating a powerful counterweight to the institutions of Western dominance. This new coalition began to build the architecture of an alternative global system, a practical escape route from a system that had been rigged against them. When they spoke of the rules-based order, the coalition asked who wrote the rules and for whose benefit, deconstructing the language of the old order. Africa's revolt had served as the catalyst, the spark that ignited a global movement of emancipation. Africa had not just freed itself, it had shown the way for others, creating a powerful coalition of the unchained, ready to collectively bargain for their rightful place in a new, more balanced world. The humiliation was a quiet spectacle, played out not in a single dramatic moment of defeat, but in 1,000 small, excruciating scenes. It was Donald Trump, at a press conference, his blustering rhetoric deflating when asked about Africa's unified defiance. This was a theater of powerlessness, where the old kings of the global stage went through the motions of authority while possessing none. They read from scripts, spoke of mutual respect, but the words rang false. The world saw it in their shifting eyes and restless hands. They were prepared for a fight, but utterly disarmed by a quiet assertion of sovereignty. They ended up shadowboxing, swinging at an opponent who'd already won by refusing to enter their arena. The humiliation extended beyond the politicians, to the institutions that had been the oracles of the old world order. For decades, their word was law. But as Africa built its own financial architecture, the oracle's power started to fade. Threats of credit downgrades were met with a shrug. The technocratic elite, who saw themselves as high priests, used to fly into African capitals and dictate policy. Now, their sermons on fiscal discipline echoed in an empty church. Western media, another oracle, suffered the same fate. Their old tropes of perpetual crisis looked lazy and outdated as Africa began telling its own stories. Ultimately, the humiliation of Trump and the wider Western establishment was not being defeated, but being ignored. A continent had moved on, too busy building its future to listen to the ghosts of a dying world order. The world did not end, but the world as we knew it did. The fall of the old order was a quiet, inexorable shift in the planet's center of gravity. a new balance has been struck, not by the force of arms, but by the force of will. A multipolar world has finally been born. This new equilibrium is a dynamic and resilient network of sovereign regions, with Africa as a central, indispensable pillar. The relationship between Africa and the West has been irrevocably altered, reset from paternalism and dependency to mutual respect. The new calculus of global power includes moral authority, resilience, and control over resources essential for the future. In this equation, Africa is a giant. This revolt is not about anger. It is about dignity, destiny, and freedom. It is the fulfillment of the prophecies of Du Bois, Nkrumah, and Sankara. The new balance is the world as it should have been. The old world order has been replaced by a more just, more hopeful balance of destiny. They thought Africa would bow forever. This was their most profound miscalculation. They built their system on the assumption of perpetual submission, believing that the psychological wounds of colonialism were permanent. They thought leaders would obey without question. But they failed to realize that the memory of Lumumba's defiance and Sankara's integrity would prove more powerful than any Swiss bank account. But Africa has risen, and the old world order is crumbling. The continent is rising not as a monolith, but as a magnificent chorus of sovereign nations, united in purpose but diverse in expression. The struggle for true, complete liberation is a journey, not a destination. But the fundamental direction has been set. The chains have been broken. The future has been reclaimed. The destiny of Africa will now be written by Africans. The world will watch, it will adapt, and it will learn. This is Insight Africa, where sovereignty is not requested but reclaimed.